Greetings, friends. You're watching Ruslan Belov's channel, and today we'll be examining the situation in Ukraine as of November 27th, 2025. A significant number of important events have taken place today, so let's begin. Today marks numerous map adjustments, with exceptionally high activity levels by Russian forces near Siversk, Sloviansk, and along the northeastern front, and naturally around the settlement of Huliaipole. From this location, we're likely receiving the most crucial footage and the most significant updates. Yesterday, we analyzed in detail the circumstances surrounding the city of Zaporizhzhia and the value and significance represented by what we might call the Zaporizhzhia Wall, this defensive line running along the P85 highway, consisting of strong points between Huliaipole and Pokrovsk. And we're observing that information is already arriving today, indicating that this defensive line has apparently either already collapsed or will collapse within the next several days. Today, the primary combat operations are unfolding around the settlement of Huliaipole. Among interesting developments worth noting, Ukrainian sources published very intriguing information today, stating that the Huliaipole direction collapsed because 2 Ukrainian armed forces units abandoned their positions without waiting for or receiving the appropriate order from military command. This front collapse occurred specifically in the area of Zeleny High and Chervone. This territory remains in a grey zone shrouded by the fog of war, but information suggests that the defense of Huliaipole collapsed precisely because Ukrainian formations withdrew from Zeleny High and Chervone without proper authorization. This allowed Russian units to rush in on the heels of the retreating Ukrainians into Huliaipole territory, specifically its southeastern and eastern sections, and establish positions there. Let's examine how the map has been adjusted over the past several days. Here, apparently, is that moment, that turning point in combat operations for Huliaipole. Starting from November 23rd, the map begins adjusting at very high rates. Here's the situation at the end of November 25th. Here's the situation at the end of November 26th, and here's the picture already at the end of November 27th. Russian units are actively advancing through Huliaipole territory itself, and the Russian army is also actively advancing towards settlements such as Dobropilya, Varvarivka, and Zelyn. Essentially, the front line has collapsed here, though not yet completely. There's still the Huliapole River. There's still a series of strongpoints located on the Ukrainian side of this river. It's precisely here that the Ukrainian side will still attempt to somehow buy time, possibly for the negotiation process. But the impression is forming that this time no longer exists. On this section, the map was adjusted in this manner. This is the situation on November 26th. Here's the picture already on November 27th. Speaking about the settlement of Huliaipole itself, the Russian army continues delivering massive aerial bombing strikes against Ukrainian armed forces positions within this city, attempting to squeeze out Ukrainian formations and force Ukrainian command to make the decision to withdraw from this settlement. However, apparently, such a decision will not be made. In this footage, we observe a drone strike against Ukrainian armed forces positions, or more precisely, against equipment attempting to enter Huliaipole territory from the west, from the direction of a Kharkiv settlement. However, the equipment doesn't even reach the city. Today, also across the network, the majority of pro-Russian Telegram channels and communities are spreading information calling on the Ukrainian garrison within Huliapole territory to surrender. And here they're also presenting this interesting map. If we examine this map, then according to these adjustments, Russian units also managed to breach Ukrainian armed forces' defenses on the Huliapole direction from the southwest as well. This kind of small pocket or cauldron was created by Russian units, and as we're already observing, the situation is maximally critical, including resembling another cauldron or another encirclement of the Ukrainian garrison. Apparently, Huliaipole will fall within the coming days. And as we discussed in the previous video, the task facing the Russian army is not simply to clear Huliaipole, but to clear it in the shortest possible time frame. And it's precisely on this phrase, shortest possible time frame, that the entire further offensive and possibly even the course of negotiations depends. I remind you that at the present moment, the Ukrainian army is maximally concentrated on strengthening this defensive line. Everything that can possibly be brought here is now being transported here, everything that can shoot and hold weapons in its hands. And the Russian army needs to clear Huliaipole in the shortest time frame, so that the Ukrainian side doesn't have time to saturate this line with personnel, equipment, materiel, and so forth. And already from Huliaipole, the Russian army will attempt with a rapid thrust to jump onto this front line, onto this defensive line, with the goal of breaking through it and establishing positions. And if this happens, if this occurs, then we can already begin the countdown for the settlement of Zaporizhia as well. First, naturally, for the settlement of Kharkiv, and subsequently for Zaporizhia. In the event of losing the Zaporizhia wall, this defense hub, the Ukrainian side will not hold Zaporizhia in 2026. Next, we're moving northward toward the settlement of Pokrovsk. Here the map is changing literally every second, daily. Yesterday we discussed a very large adjustment in the northern section. We painted many territories in favor of the Ukrainian armed forces. A large quantity of video materials was published, as well as opinions from various reliable pro-Russian experts. But now a day has passed, and the map is beginning to be adjusted again, and again in favor of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Let's discuss everything in detail. There's video material in the Kotlino area. In this footage, we can observe Russian soldiers, Russian units conducting clearing operations and fighting for forest belts north of the railway from Kotlino settlement, gradually advancing already toward Hryshyn settlement and bypassing Selydove. Also today, the first objective control footage was published confirming the presence of Russian units on Hryshyn settlement territory. This is how the map looked. Just yesterday, here we made adjustments on this section. Today, the situation along Road Iro 525 is being clarified in favor of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. This adjustment is confirmed by both neutral cartographic services and pro-Russian ones. Moreover, there's also video material published by the Ukrainian side where we could observe artillery strikes being delivered against armed forces of the Russian Federation positions on Hryshyn settlement territory in its southeastern section. Based on all these materials, all adjustments and video materials, we made the coloring. This is how the map looked yesterday. Today the Russian army apparently has confident control over the southeastern part of this settlement. Footage has also appeared from Zaporozhsky farmstead territory. Yesterday, individual neutral cartographers and pro-Russian experts colored this territory in favor of the Ukrainian armed forces, as if the Ukrainian side managed to recapture these territories. However, we added some grey zone because we still left this territory under a very big question mark. But today the first footage is already appearing, which nevertheless confirms that Russian units are nevertheless present on Zaporozhsky farmstead territory, albeit under constant pressure from the Ukrainian armed forces. Positions here are unstable, possibly even very weak, but they nevertheless exist, and the Russian army is attempting to dig in and establish itself even more on this direction. The Ukrainian side counterattacks here, constantly both with infantry units and constantly attempts to attack these territories, Zaporozhsky farmstead, using drones. Therefore, for now, we're maintaining, accordingly, the cauldron for Myrnohrad. There is, so to speak, a complete encirclement. Speaking about Myrnohrad, the Russian army is also advancing on this section. Today, Russian units are actively clearing the southern part of the Myrnohrad cauldron. The Russian army, as you can see, is advancing on the very southwestern outskirts of Myrnohrad city, as well as along the railway. In the near future, apparently, the front line will indeed be straightened approximately along this red line, after which battles will already begin for Myrnohrad itself, for its southern part, and for the final neighborhoods and blocks. In the northeastern section, map adjustments are also noted. According to various, shall we say, neutral cartographic services, Russian units are reaching the central mine toward this direction, toward this section. I remind you that important footage arrived from this section yesterday. In this video, which we won't watch, published by the Ukrainian side, several Russian saboteurs were captured in the central mine area, which tells us that possibly even this map configuration no longer corresponds to the reality that exists on the section. Apparently, the Ukrainian side doesn't even control what you see before your eyes. Apparently, here there's already something like a vinaigrette, something like a sandwich, and not simply this yellow piece under AFU control. Russian units are also actively advancing in the Dobropilia zone. After the unsuccessful counter-offensive by the Ukrainian armed forces that began in the second half of August and ended approximately in the second half of October, The Russian army required literally several weeks for regrouping. And now the Russian army is transitioning again to the offensive, the goal of which is reaching Dobropilya, reaching Belitske, reaching the Novi Donbas defense line, as well as toward Druzhkivka. The map, as you see on this section, has also undergone substantial changes. This is how the map looked yesterday, November 26th. Today adjustments are being made. And we'll begin with the settlement of Dorozhnie and Ivanovka. Neutral cartographic services are clarifying the situation in the grey zones area. We're adjusting maps because confirmations about Dorozhnie never appeared, so we're returning, so to speak, the territory back under control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, an analogous situation in the Kharkiv area. But the most important news, of course, consists in the fact that the Russian army has already approached closely to Sofiivka settlement, both from the south and from the east. There's an extremely high probability that already in these days combat operations will begin for the village itself, after which the Russian army will move further toward Toretsk. In the event of losing control over Toretsk, Sofiivka and Kharkiv, already officially, so to speak, with confirmation from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, Russian units will definitely emerge into serious operational space and will begin moving toward Druzhkivka settlement to approach as close as possible to the main supply lines, to the N20 highway, which Ukrainian armed forces units use to maintain the contingent on Kostiantynivka territory. On the Kostiantynivka section, there are also small adjustments in the Yablunivka settlement area. Today, various cartographic services report that the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to advance along the N20 highway and take under full control another strongpoint. This large strongpoint located along the road was cleared by Russian units in recent days, and confident control was established. Of course, we're awaiting additional geolocation, but this is a most important advance. The Russian army is also advancing toward the N20 highway further north, and N32, with the goal of reaching toward Berostok settlement from the west, as well as toward Stepanivka settlement from the east. That is, here, apparently, the Russian army will attempt to wedge into the Ukrainian armed forces' defensive ranks to cut the section into several directions and subsequently deal separately with both Stepanivka and Berostok settlement. And the most probably interesting or most active direction today is no longer the Siversk direction, not the Lyman direction. I think that starting today it's more correct to already call it the Sloviansk direction. Pay attention to the quantity of icons symbolizing FPV drone strikes executed by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. There are several dozen of them here. That is, today by geolocations, by strikes and by the activity level of FPV drone operators, the Sloviansk direction is the most active. There's no such quantity and such concentration of FPV drone icons on any other front section. That is, total control has been established here over practically every square centimeter, starting in the Sloviansk-Lyman-Siversk triangle. The Russian army completely controls the entire area, blocking and paralyzing Ukrainian logistics, preventing the approach and delivery of reinforcements and supplies to the front line. Moreover, today on this section, we haven't gone without adjustments either, and the most important adjustments today are arriving to us from the southeastern Sloviansk direction, from the territory of Vasyukivka and Zaliznianska settlements. Today, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation reports that the Russian army managed to completely clear Vasyukivka settlement. I remind you that a week earlier, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation announced the clearing of Pazino settlement. Now we're observing that Russian units are actively attempting to advance toward Nikiforivka settlement, apparently attempting to encircle Kromivka and Bondan. And overall here we're observing, most likely we'll be observing advancement along the Siversky Donets, Donbas Canal toward Ry-Alexandrivka settlement. Also today, Russian units are actively advancing on the Lyman section. Complete paralysis of Ukrainian logistics is also noted. Hundreds of Russian drones are flying here, 24 hours, 7 days a week, preventing delivery of either ammunition or personnel. Exclusively equipment is being destroyed, infantry apparently isn't even being paid attention to. Now, equipment is worth its weight in gold, especially when there's such control, and especially when the Russian army is actively advancing, and there must constantly be some supply, and there must constantly be rotation, delivery of fresh forces, and evacuation of the wounded. And now we're observing that this isn't happening. Also today, individual pro-Russian experts report advancement by Russian units east of Lyman settlement. But based on the adjustment area provided by various pro-Russian experts, one can conclude that the entire eastern flank of Lyman has completely collapsed. The Russian army is actively and with a broad front entering Lyman settlement territory. Apparently, on this section in the near future, combat operations of very high intensity will begin. Trump and Driscoll conveyed a message to Zelensky. Its essence consists in the fact that regardless of what decision you make within 12 months, or perhaps earlier, the Russian army will still clear the entire Donetsk region anyway, and then, apparently, the Russian Federation will put forward new demands. Therefore, right now Zelensky must agree to what's being proposed so as not to lose even more in the future. During recent video materials, we discussed what specifically Ukraine might lose if they don't begin negotiating. At least, this is the reality in which Zelensky and Ukraine's Supreme Command possibly now live. Information is also arriving that Russian units are becoming more active on the very northernmost part of the Donetsk region. These settlements, Korovy Yar, Krimki, Oleksandrivka, Yatskovka, Rubtsi, Lozov and Volchy Yar, and Kharkivka, are part of the Donetsk region. Therefore, here also in the near future, high combat activity should be expected. It's difficult to say regarding the Borova direction. Here, this direction the Russian army, for some reason, constantly bypasses, but apparently here, movement should also be expected. Next, we're moving to the northeastern part of Kharkiv region. Today, from this section, a great deal of news is also arriving. And as you can see by the concentration of various icons and various events on this section, one can say that the Russian army, having cleared at least the western, southwestern and southern part of Vovchansk settlement, the Russian army has emerged into operational space and is already beginning its offensive toward Huliapole settlement. Today there are adjustments. Let's look at how the map was adjusted. This is how the map looked just yesterday, November 26, 2025. Today, some cartographers, as well as geolocations, confirm further advancement of Russian units. The most important adjustments today are arriving to us from the southern part of Vovchansk. As we're observing, less and less of Vovchansk city remains under Ukrainian armed forces control, and apparently in the near future, in the coming week, most likely the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm full control over Vovchansk and its loss by the Ukrainian armed forces. In turn, Ukrainian units are attempting to transfer reinforcements to this direction through Vovchansky Khutori, Byli Kolodyaz, Vovchansky Khutori. However, here Russian FPV drone operators are also constantly working, and as soon as Ukrainian formation movement is detected, strikes are immediately delivered against them. But the most important adjustments today are arriving from the territory of Vilcha and Lyman settlements. Not the Lyman that's Krasny Lyman, but Lyman in the Vovchansk area. This is how the map was adjusted over the past day, a large, substantial advance. The most important thing is Vilcha settlement. Today from this section, a large quantity of footage is arriving of how Russian units are demolishing one after another buildings that are possibly being used by Ukrainian armed forces units for temporary deployment points. And we're observing that beyond simply destroying temporary deployment points of AFU units, the Russian army managed to break through the settlement's defenses from the west and grab hold of the first buildings. This is the adjustment that some cartographic services are providing today, according to which Zoriana Street and Mira Street partially came under Russian army control, and armed forces of the Russian Federation units continue the offensive. As soon as the Ukrainian side loses control over Vilcha and as soon as Russian units manage to establish themselves, this is definitely the beginning of the Byli Kolodyaz offensive operation. Russian units also continue advancing south of Sinelnikov Forest. Today battles are already underway for settlements such as Lyman, and Russian units are approaching Prilipivka and Grafske. Adjustments are present on the map, as you see, and overall we're observing that despite the fact that winter is already arriving, possibly cold weather, and if we even recall the winter campaign of 2024-2025, that is last winter, then the Russian army wasn't advancing as actively as we're observing now. Apparently, this will be a very hot winter, a negotiating winter, and possibly by February the picture will change. Why am I saying that the picture might change by February? Because the current martial law will end, I believe, on February 5th, 2026. And there's an extremely high probability that precisely this martial, so to speak, law, the Verkhovna Rada and Ukraine's parliament will no longer extend. And that's everything, dear friends. Thank you for watching, subscribe to the channel, give your likes, and all the best to you.